This video is brought to you by Sporlan, quality, integrity, and tradition. So we've got a walk-in cooler that's given us problems. I had a service technician out here over the weekend defrosting one of the coils, and actually defrosting both coils, which is going to be kind of strange. But when he turned it back on, he noticed that this evaporator coil wasn't getting cold, okay? So if we look right here, I want to show you something. You see that TXV? It doesn't look good, okay? But I don't know where the problem lies. Is it the TXV or is it the solenoid valve, okay? And this one's a little tricky. Suction line temperature is the outlet of the solenoid valve, 47.8 degrees. Discharge line temp is the inlet of the solenoid valve, 49 degrees, okay? Supply air temperature is the supply of this coil. Supply air 1 is 40 degrees, and return air 1 is the return of this coil. So we're getting no temperature differential. So 40 and 40, right? The other one is the other evaporator coil, the main coil, 36 and 26. That coil's working. Sorry about the focus issue, but the other coil's working, right? So the other coil's kicking butt. This coil's intermittently working because my technician, when he came over to the weekend, he had to de-ice this coil and the other coil. But there's clearly something going on with that expansion valve, but I'm curious, is it the solenoid valve too? I don't think so. Even though there is a temperature difference across the solenoid valve, it's very small, like 1 to 2 degrees, and I don't think that's a problem. If anything, I think it's conduction from this frosting TXV that's coming down and dropping the temperature of that clamp. So we've got a bad TXV on this guy. So what we're gonna do is head up to the roof, and we're gonna pump the system down, and we're gonna get ready to replace this expansion valve. So I'm up on the roof, and we're gonna pump the system down. So we've got service gauges on it. I'm on the liquid line and the suction line right here. And what we're gonna do is we're gonna front seat this receiver king valve, okay? So we push the stem all the way up into the receiver, we front seat it. The system is gonna stop the refrigerant flow coming out of the receiver, and we're gonna slowly see our suction pressure drop lower and lower as the system's pumping down. Now always pay attention to the head pressure when you're pumping systems down too. It can be an indication of an overcharge when you're trying to pump it down and the head pressure just starts climbing. Notice that the head pressure dropped, and that's actually because of where I have it installed, but I strategically did this. Now I did bring up the point that you want to pay attention to the head pressure as you're pumping it down, and actually the way that I have the high side connected, you won't see the true system head pressure. In order to see the head pressure, you'd want to be put right here, and then this would tell you what's going on. Now, but we're fine. You know, I know the system's not overcharged. But we're gonna wait for the system to turn back on, okay? This does have a time delay, so notice that the pressures are coming up kind of high. We're gonna pump it down again, get the residual refrigerant out. We'll open up the low side, and then we gotta go figure out how to size the expansion valve. So I did say that it had a time delay. In this case, all that I did was push in the contactor until the pressures got low enough, and it dropped down. Now I just have the low side cracked, so we're venting to atmosphere the remaining residual refrigerant that we couldn't get out. And we're gonna head downstairs. Now what I'm gonna do is we're going to try to figure out what size TXV this system needs. There's a couple quick methods, and I'll pull up a screenshot right now of the Sporlan document. I believe it's 500-10, and I'll confirm that right now. And that's for sizing expansion valves on AWEF compliant condensing units and evaporators, okay? This particular evaporator is about an 11,000 BTU evaporator, and we do have an AWEF compliant unit. That's an annual walk-in energy efficiency factor. Federal government regulations are basically just hitting the refrigeration sector and making our equipment need to be more energy efficient. So they put in 2-speed motors, this particular one, they put an extra subcooling loop. There is no head pressure control valve on this one, just a subcooling loop, but they do fan cycling. But with that being said, because they're floating the head pressure down so low, Whether or not you have a head pressure control valve, or if you have fan cycling like this one, they're dropping the head pressure lower than you've ever seen it before. The expansion valve needs to be sized correctly. And we've come up with a 3/4 to a 1.5 ton expansion valve. Now this is a 448A system. I built this valve with my Sporlan BQ kit, so I used the correct cartridge, and I believe the cartridge is an A cartridge, and I have a little tag on there right now. This is going to be the valve that we're going to install inside there. This is a 448A expansion valve. So we're going to head downstairs, get it replaced, then we'll come back up here, change the dryer, and pull an evacuation on the system. All right, I went ahead and brought my nitrogen up top. I got the regulator set for braze. We're going in on the high side, or on the liquid line, and it's coming back through. I can hear it just ever so slightly coming through on there. So we're going to leave that off. So we are purging with nitrogen. We're trying to prevent any of the carbon, you know, whatever flake buildup inside there that potentially could have caused this expansion valve to go bad in the first place, right? But the new one's going to have a strainer on it that's removable, so if it ever was to get plugged up, we could pop it off. I'm pretty sure there's a strainer on the existing valve, but it's internal, so you got to unsweat it to pull the strainer, which is silly. So we'll do that, and then we'll come back up. I've got a new Sporlan catch-all right here that'll go on this guy when we're ready. We're cutting the valve out because it has a different orientation, and there's plenty of slack in the pipe to make the other orientation work. I do have a straight through valve, but I prefer the angle stop one that has a removable strainer. I believe on the other valve it's called an EVACUE, would be the straight through Sporlan valve, but like I said, I prefer the one that has the removable strainer. So I was holding this so that way it doesn't crack, and then slowly bending it to get it to line right up. Now the one thing we have to be careful about, we still have to be able to get this solenoid coil off, so I got to maneuver it in the right way. There we go. There we go, the valve is where it needs to be, and then now we're going to get some heat blocking compound on there and then braze it in. Alright, got some of the Viper wet rag heat blocking compound on there. I got it propped up with my tubing cutter so it doesn't drop. We're going to braze it in. Alright, the valve's installed. I'm going to get the wet rag off, cool it off, clean it up, inspect it one more time. I hit it with a MIRA once, but I want to see it with all the heat blocking compound off. Got the sensing bulb safely ran where it's not going to rub out on anything. We'll secure it right in there so it's safe. And then we got it strapped with 2 clamps, okay? Always have 2 clamps on that guy. Nice and tight, and we'll get it insulated and cleaned up in a bit. But we're going to go do the rooftop and get the evacuation running once we change the dryer. Then while the evacuation's running, we can come down here and start playing with insulation and things. I'm currently doing the evacuation. I was gonna pull through my manifold, but my hose, my large diameter hose, was leaking on my manifold, so I couldn't. But in a pump down system, I mean, pulling through a manifold really isn't a big deal because you're never gonna obtain a perfect vacuum, especially if it's an old system, because everything leaks, right? The valves leak, the internals in the compressor will leak, the king valve will leak, just ever so slightly, but enough that you'll be chasing a vacuum. And usually, I mean, it's, you know, you can probably do it every once in a while, but usually you'll end up pulling all the refrigerant out of the system before you get a perfect vacuum, okay? So with that being said, I went ahead and grabbed a large diameter hose, connected it to a Schrader core remover. We're pulling from the liquid line only. The solenoid valves downstairs are open, so it's running all the way downstairs, then coming back up on the suction line, and that is a true evacuation, because we're not pulling on that. So 725. So if I could see, I mean, honestly, that's better than I expected to see anyways, but if I could see, you know, 5 to 600 range, we'll be fine. Typically on refrigeration, you want to get lower than 500 microns. But yeah, I'm not gonna try to get below 500 because, again, we'll start pulling all the refrigerant out. So I went ahead and put a Sporlan catch-all going downstairs, protecting the expansion valves and everything. And again, we were flowing with nitrogen the entire time. So once we get done with the evacuation, we'll go downstairs and do the startup on the coils. All I have to do is release the refrigerant from this valve right here. So once I open up this king valve, the refrigerant will flow through the system, down through the liquid line, then come back up through the suction line, turn the compressor on, and we'll be able to check to see if that expansion valve is now working properly. All right, at this point, it's in decay and it's holding at 657 and not rising. So we're gonna go ahead and open the system up. So what I'm gonna do, if I can get the cap off, I'll put it on by hand. So now we're gonna leave the gauges and everything on because we don't want to introduce oxygen into the system. The vacuum gauge can handle slight positive pressure. So just slightly let it flow through. The system should turn on here in a second, and see the pressure's coming up. There we go. We can go ahead and take this off once we have positive pressure, and then I'll let it run for a minute, finish opening the king valve, and I'll put my service gauges on it, and then we'll finish evaluating the system. So it doesn't look too crazy. It's 448A. We're running about 326 head pressure, which is about 121 degree saturation temp, 54 back pressure, 27 degree saturation. It's about 115, 114 degrees outside. Looks like it's kind of ranging around. It's right here. It's hot. So sight glass is slightly flashing, but the system just started up. Don't, you always let it stabilize out, okay? Those expansion valves are finding their happy point right now. So just give it time and the sight glass will likely clear up. We're gonna go downstairs, insulate the suction line, and have a look at what's going on. Got return and supply probes on each one. So supply air on the coil I put the TXV on is, if I get it to focus, 36 degrees. Supply air on my other coil is 35. Return air on both coils is approximately 45. So you can see we have about a 10 degree temperature split from return. There's my supply probe, and there's my return probe, and I have it in the same spot on each one. See, the expansion valve looks a lot better. It's just frosting at the distribution tubes right at the distributor, and everything seems fine. I went ahead and insulated the suction line back in there, and we're gonna watch this guy come down in temperature, and I'm actually gonna change an evaporator fan motor on the other coil because when my technician was out here over the weekend defrosting it, he found one of them had a bad evaporator fan motor. So we're gonna take care of that too. So I went ahead and pulled apart the existing expansion valve. The pins are in there. The pins take the power head pressure and push down on the spring, or on the seat right there, which is being pushed up by the spring. So the power head pressure has to oppose the pressure of the spring to allow refrigerant to flow through the system. I don't see anything wrong with there. I can blow from the liquid line through the valve, so there's no restriction in the valve. Don't see anything built up. There's no carbon buildup inside of it or anything like that. So more than likely the failure is in the power head. This is not a removable power head. That's a flaw of this particular valve. The Sporlan valves have the ability to change just the power head. And if this problem happened on a Sporlan valve, I would have just pumped it down and done a power head change first before I tried changing the valve. Because there's really not a whole lot in an expansion valve that's going to fail. I mean, look at it. A spring, a seat, a needle, and 2 pins to push down on the spring. I mean, as long as it's not gummed up with gunk, there's really not much there. So yeah, I'm gonna say this one probably had a bad power head and that valve had to be replaced because of that. As far as why it iced up in the first place, probably just left the door open because it's 43 right there, 42 right there. That's close enough. I'm not gonna worry about that. It's only set for 37 degrees. So we'll make sure before I leave that it shuts off. You know, most of the walk-in repairs I've been getting lately have been very like just defrosting, changing fan motors, defrosting, changing time clocks. This one was actually a nice little change of pace. It's been a while though since I've had a failed TXV. They don't really fail. I mean, honestly, there's not much in a TXV to fail. Unless you just completely abuse your system and it's just full of junk and crud and, you know, all kinds of weird additives that people add. But for the most part, most of the places that I service, there's not a lot of people working on them. So you're not running into a lot of weird, you know, situations like that. But, you know, mostly, I mean, on a TXV, strainers get plugged up and power heads fail. That's really, you know, all that usually fails on them. And, you know, oftentimes, like with the Sporlan TXVs, you can rebuild them. I mean, there's even been times when I'll just take a TXV and take all the guts out if it does need to be replaced and just replace the guts. You know, just put a new, take the new TXV, take all the parts out, put them in the new one, screw it in, and then you don't even have to braze it in. But I really like putting in those TXVs that have the removable strainers. Those are so important. And I keep a bunch of those removable strainers in my Sporlan BQ kit. I know I've shown that before. But yeah, if you ever suspect a TXV not working, you always want to start with the strainer because, you know, especially now this one, you couldn't get to the strainer because and actually it didn't even have a strainer at all. But if it did, it would be a inline strainer that would have been brazed in. So there would have been no point in trying to unbraze it. So you saw that, you know, I went through the motions of doing this. I was a little leery, like, is it the solenoid valve? Usually if the solenoid valve is failing and if it's just slowly bleeding by, there'll be a pretty big temperature drop. So I think at one point I saw 3 degrees and at one point I saw like 1 or 2 degrees. That's not big enough for me to suspect the solenoid valve, you know? And so I suspected the TXV was the problem. It's very rare for me in my situations that solenoid valves fail. It's super rare. So pump the system down, change the TXV. Now I mentioned that I was cutting the TXV out. I don't always cut things out. I don't always cut dryers out. I don't always cut TXVs out. In this situation, I cut out 2 of the braze joints because I was going to be changing the orientation of the valve. But the last one I didn't cut out because I knew that I wanted to reuse that little section of pipe. So I was able to kind of dry fit everything together. And it wasn't perfect having the external equalizer line kind of wavy. You know, if that was a brand new install, I could have made it super straight and super nice. But because that copper had been, I think that coil is maybe a year old or something like that, maybe a year and a half. I have lost track of time since COVID, so it could have been 2 years for all I know. But I know I made a video doing the install on those. But when that coil gets, you know, when the copper gets older, it gets a little harder to manipulate. So, but also, you know, you saw me kind of moving the copper lines around. Always hold the braze points with your hands if possible. Like I didn't really hold the braze points of the distribution tubes because I wasn't too concerned with those. It's kind of an experience thing where you can kind of look at a joint and say, okay, that's something that I'm concerned about. The distribution lines, I wasn't too concerned about those ones. So I was able to dry fit it all back together, protect the valve, pushing nitrogen through, braze it in, no big deal, and then started it back up. And we had a complete change of operation, right? Instantly, we had a TXV that was working properly. We had a temperature differential. And had they used a Sporlan TXV with a removable power head or, you know, another TXV with a removable power head, we could have just changed the power head and we wouldn't have to go through the entire process. That's why I really like keeping that BQ kit on my van because, you know, you just go get the parts, you put it together, you install it, you know. Same thing. If it was a Sporlan valve and it had a bad power head, just pump it down, change the power head. You know, no big deal, and you don't have to braze the whole valve in. So I highly encourage these manufacturers. I don't think many manufacturers watch my videos, but I highly encourage you guys to start thinking about the service technicians and start installing parts that are smart for us, that make the repairs easier. It only seems logical. I know that it's about making money and selling boxes and all that stuff, but at the same time too, for the service technician, the guy that has to save the day and make your equipment work properly when it does have a failure, you know, it seems that you should make it easier for the service technician so that way they can be more successful and make it easier. Had they used a Sporlan TXV with a removable power head and a strainer, a right angle valve, SBQE valve, 3x4x2 was the size of this one, then that would have been an easy repair. I would have popped the strainer out, investigated it, and if it was clean, would have put that back in and changed the power head real quick and then moved on. It would have been a super simple repair instead of a, you know, 4 to 6 hour job to change a TXV and all that good stuff. But in the end, it's all good. We got them operational. Now, I did mention something that I had to change an evaporator fan motor. Well, first, let's go to this. I don't know what caused that system to ice up in the first place. I didn't see the ice. I wasn't, you know, it was one of my other service techs that was there. So I didn't see what type of ice. Ice patterns do make a difference. They can usually tell you a lot. I didn't see how it was iced up. He didn't get me a picture of it, but that's fine. So after I changed the TXV and got it operational, the next thing that I was thinking was, okay, what if the temperature controller wasn't working properly? So I did a comparison with my thermometer and the sensing bulb of the temp control, and they seemed accurate. The temperature controller had built-in defrost. It's a KE2 temp plus defrost controller. I think that might have been a rebranded one, but still, it had defrost built into it. It had 6 defrosts a day for 20 minutes at each time, so that's plenty sufficient for the defrost. This particular customer is notorious for leaving the door open, so I'm not going to sweat that one. More than likely, they just left the door open, okay? Next thing, when my technician was there, he noticed that one of the evaporator fan motors on the other coil that I didn't work on wasn't working. So what I actually had him do, because it was a Saturday, was I had him put a motor in there that wasn't the right size, okay? It was a watt motor, but it was too small, so it was actually overamping. But it got us through the weekend, and that's why, even though you saw when I walked in the motor was still working, we weren't going to leave a motor in there that was overamping. We just got him going through the weekend, and then I went back in there with the OEM motor, put it back in. System is operational. All is well. Okay, I really appreciate y'all making it to the end of the video. A couple things I did talk about in the video was the Sporlan document 500-10. That's the AWEF expansion valve selection document. You definitely want to check that out. That was the one that I showed. Just all you got to do is Google Sporlan 500-10. It'll come up as a PDF. You can download it. It'll help you to size expansion valves when you're dealing with AWEF compliant condensing units. Okay, so it's really important. Pretty much everything out there that's produced these days is going to be AWEF compliant. It's a Department of Energy regulation that basically says that refrigeration equipment on walk-ins under 3,000 square feet has to be sized and meet certain energy efficiency requirements. Okay, now one important thing about the AWEF compliance, something to understand, is they don't necessarily go to the manufacturer and say all of your units need 2-speed motors. All of your units need microchannel coils. They more or less give them a criteria of energy efficiency numbers that they have to meet, and the manufacturers are allowed to choose how they want to meet those energy efficiency criteria. So some choose to use head pressure control valves that bypass at 100 or 150 psi. Some choose to use fan cycle controls. Some choose to use extra subcooling loops like this particular one in a tube and fin condenser. Some choose to use microchannel condensers. I mean, so it just, each manufacturer has their own little drum beat that they, work to. And just keep that in mind, okay? But download that Sporlan document 500-10. It'll help you in sizing these valves. And that's very, very important, especially in the wintertime. Because in the wintertime, they're floating that head pressure down, which means they're dropping the head pressure to reduce the energy consumption of that compressor. If you drop the head pressure, okay, you change the compression ratio, you change the energy consumed, right? The amount of work that it's going to take to do what it needs to do and electricity it consumes. So When they do that, though, it lowers the liquid temperature of the refrigerant. And your expansion valve is typically, on the older expansion valves, were designed for 90 to 100 degree liquid temp. Well, we're not running 90 to 100 degree liquid temp anymore. We're much lower. And that valve may or may not be sized correctly, okay? It's most important that we understand that if we're dealing with AWEF compliant units, you're typically going to have a balance port expansion valve, okay? Balance port is like a key factor in the expansion valve selection for AWEF compliant units, okay? But it's not just balance port. It also needs to make sure that at the lowest operating ambient conditions and at the highest operating ambient conditions, that the valve is still going to perform and feed the right amount of refrigerant, okay? So that's why it's so important. So check out that Sporlan document. It'll definitely help you out when you're sizing those valves. Again, I really appreciate you guys making it to the end of the video as usual. Check out my website, hvacrvideos.com. We have merchandise available, a couple different methods you can do to support the channel, Patreon, PayPal, YouTube channel memberships. There's links in the show notes. Last but not least, if you're interested in purchasing any tools, check out truetech.tools.com. I have an offer code. It's actually like an affiliate program, right? So if you use my offer code, big picture, one word, you get an 8% discount on most of their items, and I get a small commission every time you use that offer code. So it's a great way to help support the channel. You get tools out of the thing. Again, I really appreciate y'all, and we will catch you on the next one.